Hello, and welcome to Insider Insights. I'm Mariana Siciliano, and I'm an educator in public programs and creative practice at the Met. I'm delighted to welcome you to this series that offers a closer look at objects across the Met's collection and special exhibitions with museum experts. Today's program is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Making the Met, 1870 to 2020, on view until January 3rd. The exhibition commemorates the museum's 150th anniversary and tells the story of the institution's development through 10 transformative moments. In this program, we'll be exploring the Met's formative years and focusing on some of the early works of art collected by the museum. We'll learn about how they came into the collection, their significance then and now, and hear about recent directions the museum has taken in its collecting practice. With us today are Andrea Bayer, curator of the exhibition and Deputy Director for Collections and Administration, and Amelia Peck, Maritza F. Vilcek Curator, American Decorative Arts, and Supervising Curator of the Antonio Ratti Textile Center. Thank you to both of you for being here today. And Andrea, it's my pleasure to hand things over to you to begin our program.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I'm so happy to be here today with my wonderful colleague and good friend, Amelia Peck, to talk to you about the exhibition, Making the Met. As Mariana has mentioned, this is an exhibition that tells the history of the museum through 10 episodes that we believe changed the museum's direction, its evolution, its DNA. And we think that as you go through them, you come out with an idea of how a museum that started in 1870 without a building, without a collection, without a staff, became the museum that we know it today. This is our signature image, and I love this image. It's taken from a great archival photograph of 1910 of a family looking at Loitz's Washington crossing the Delaware, melded together with a photograph of 2019 that shows some of our young visitors, because this is indeed an exhibition about people, art, and the passage of time. So Amelia and I are going to talk about two major formative trends of the earliest years of the museum. We're calling them the view from Europe, including Great Britain, and the view from America. And in those two buckets, let's say, we're talking about both objects from those places, but also points of view about what museums should be and what kind of museum the Metropolitan Museum was for its American visitors. So ideals for our visitors and our audience. You'll see that at some times these two views were quite separate, but then at other times they overlapped. They were fundamental for the development of the first 50, 60 years of the museum and left a lasting legacy. In fact, we'll come back to this idea of legacy. How do we look at these works of art today? And what directions are we going in for the future? So I'm going to begin with the view from Europe. And what I mean by that is that there were a group of businessmen, collectors, some women, who believed that the Met in New York should be able to rival the great treasure houses of Europe. And in order to make that happen, they traveled and sought out some of the most wonderful works of art that they could put their hands on, that came often from noble and aristocratic collections in Europe, or through dealers who could lead them to such objects. They had a desire to really, let's say, recreate the stature of the great European collections. And therefore, they were working towards certain standards that were of extreme importance to them. One about authenticity and connoisseurship. Other standards about material splendor, the materials from which works were made, their rarity, and their histories. For these collectors, the long history of works of art resonated enormously. And so they helped the museum get from that moment in 1870 when there was nothing to build on until a moment in 1913 when one trustee said, you know, we now have a collection at the forefront of the world's collections that can rival the Louvre and Madrid. But to get there, they had to go through a long period in which authors and critics questioned what had come to the museum so far, saying, for example, that it was a collection in the early years that contained no first-rate example of a first-rate genius, or that there was a lot of money being thrown around, and it could buy exquisite things, but it didn't really buy a collection. So what we're presenting to you through this brief snapshot is the movement from those early stumbling formative years, first years, to something of real accomplishment by about 1913. The examples I'm showing you on the screen, two of them came from the collection of Benjamin Altman, the great retailer, in fact, who died in 1913 and about whose collection that quotation comes, that it puts us at the forefront of the museums in the world. He owned some 13 Rembrandts, one of which you see on the left, the Toilet of Bathsheba. And I'm going to talk about this picture again at the end of this discussion. And he believed that the golden age of Dutch paintings was one of the most important things that he could bring to the museum. He also owned the fantastic Antonio Rossellino, Madonna and Child at the right, still considered one of the greatest Italian sculptures in the United States. And finally, there's the Vermeer at the center of this screen. Vermeer is such a special case in this whole history, because although the rediscovery of Vermeer had started in the 19th century in Europe, it picked up momentum in the early years of the 20th century amongst American collectors who began to bring works by Vermeer to New York collections, the Frick and the Metropolitan Museum. And it made an enormous splash because it was a rediscovery and because it was something that really was a contribution to the history of art in the museum itself. And I just want to mention about the Vermeer at the center that it belonged to the Huntington family. And interestingly, it was first put on view in New York in 1909 in the so-called Hudson-Fulton exhibition. Amelia is going to tell you quite a bit about that exhibition and its relationship to the study of American art. But half of that exhibition was dedicated to Dutch paintings in honor of the Dutch underwriting of Hudson's exploration and of the Dutch background of so many New Yorkers. So the presiding genius of this moment, of the moment of looking to Europe for treasures and bringing them to New York for their preciousness, rarity, provenance, etc. The presiding genius was J. Pierpont Morgan. And this is what it looked like to an outsider. There he was with a gigantic $ magnet, drawing everything from the old world to the new world. Now, it is true that the scale of his collecting is almost unimaginable to us. His bequest, the bequest given by his son to the museum, was of some 7,000 objects. And of course, he also left an enormous legacy to the Morgan Library and Museum and to the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, which is where his family came from. But he would have strongly disputed the idea that he was interested in pulling anything over with his magnet to New York. On the contrary, he was the person who insisted, in fact, that these issues of quality that I've been talking about, of authenticity and rarity and so on, were at the forefront of his mind as he was trying to collect. He was always collecting with the idea that his collections would go to the public in the United States, and he wanted people to see the best of historic European culture. I'm showing you two examples of the kind of things that he loved here at the right. Both of them are in the exhibition. One is a piece of porcelain. It's called Medici porcelain. It's from the first group of true porcelains made in Europe from the 1570s in Florence. There are only some 70 pieces of it that have come down to us. And at the center, these two absolutely exquisite alabaster mourners that come from the tomb of Jean Duc de Berry. So that goes back to what I'm saying about the importance of the historical connections for these collectors. These objects are seen together in the extraordinary case that we've built for them in the exhibition. You can see the real depth of this type of collecting. It begins with antiquities and goes all the way up to the 18th century. It's global in the sense that these collectors loved works from Egypt and the Middle East and Asia, as well as from Europe. And it shows works that were collected by Morgan and his contemporaries, as well as much more recent collectors, such as Iris Cantor, whose foundation gave us the Rodin bust of Balzac, or Charles and Jane Reitzman, whose great vase we see at the end. So I'm suggesting here that the kind of collecting that was begun by Morgan, Altman, Huntington's, continued on all through our history and has played an enormously important role in the development of collections across the board in the Metropolitan Museum. At the same time that they were looking for works, individual works of rarity and quality, they were also thinking about the Met as a place that had strong educational goals. And again, Amelia is going to talk about this in much more depth, but I wanted to introduce you to the idea that these two avenues of collecting were not done by separate people. They were two trends for all of these important founders of the museum. Here I'm showing you a painting on the right that gives you a sense of the interior of a design shop in Paris in 1906 that was owned by George Henschel. Morgan went to visit this shop. It had a floor filled with medieval objects and a floor filled with 17th and 18th century objects. And he bought the entire thing, 365 crates of objects from the Henschel collections were packed up and sent to New York City in 1906, 1907. And an entire wing had to be built to hold them, called the Morgan Wing. You get a little bit of an idea on our installation here at the left that they included furniture, they included paneling from homes, they included decorative ornamental motifs, and so on. When he brought them to New York City and installed them, Morgan wanted them to have a curator who would introduce all of these objects, these objets d'art, to the New York public. He hired somebody named Wilhelm Valentiner, became our first curator of decorative arts, and Valentiner worked with an explicitly educational purpose. I'm going to quote him here. He did this to educate the American public not familiar with the art and culture of an extraordinarily rich past, give them an acquaintance with the outstanding examples of artistic achievement. They opened the wing to students and copyists. Everyone was welcome to come in and study, and it was considered an absolutely fundamental place for American designers, artisans, artists, decorators, manufacturers. So those two aspects went hand in hand for Morgan and his contemporaries: the educational purposes of the Metropolitan Museum and the desire to make it a treasure house, not unlike the great treasure houses of Europe. I just remind you the directions in which this can go, including the great period rooms donated by Charles and Jane Reitzman, which often considered individual pieces of furniture that had an extraordinary history. Here we see a desk that belonged to Louis XV, but are set within an environment that is meant to introduce the visitor to a whole culture and whole ambiance from a historical period. And also that the same approaches continue to inspire donors and collectors absolutely up to our days. So this wall, which I find one of the most unusual and beautiful walls of the exhibition, includes two great portraits, one of the Princesse de Broglie, which comes from the Lehman collection. So it doesn't arrive to the museum until the mid-1970s. And one of Mrs. Reitzman's last gifts to the museum, Van Dyck's portrait of the English Queen Henrietta Maria on the right. Sandwiched in between them are three panels of an early Sienese polyptych. Again, a Lehman gift and another gift by George Blumenthal. So these collectors continue to work in the same way as Morgan had, looking for the rarest and the most precious things, the things that they felt actually did make New York a treasure house. This sums it up for me, and I'm going to turn over to Amelia.
Well, thank you, Andrea. And you'll see that Andrea and I are going to be talking about some of the same people and some of the same ideas, but I'm going to head into it more in the American version of the story, The View from America. Anyway, here you see J.P. Morgan again. In addition to being a voracious collector and consummate museum patron, J.P. Morgan was an effective and forward-thinking president of the museum from 1904 until the end of his life in 1913. After the death of the museum's first director, Luigi Palma di Cesnola, the newly elected Morgan joined with Secretary to the Board of Trustees, lawyer and philanthropist Robert W. DeForest, who you also see here, to create a new agenda and fresh agenda for the museum. The annual report of 1905, signed by Morgan and DeForest, stated that among the museum's goal, in quotes, it will be the aim of the trustees not merely to assemble beautiful objects and display them harmoniously, still less to amass a collection of unrelated curios, but to group together the masterpieces of different countries and times in relation and sequence, as to illustrate the history of art in the broadest sense, to make plain its teaching, and to inspire and direct its national development. Having set out the ideal of building a truly encyclopedic museum, the authors reiterated that the institution's original 1870 educational mission was, in quotes, was not merely that of establishing a great collection of art objects, but also of encouraging and developing the study of fine arts and the application of arts to manufacture and practical life. To illustrate this educational goal, the second gallery of Making the Met highlights the creation of study collections at the museum in the early decades of the 20th century. The gallery, which we call Art for All, focuses on two trailblazing early curators and phenomenal collections builders, William Ivins, curator of the departments of works on paper from 1916 to 1946, and Miss Frances Morris, curator of musical instruments beginning in 1896 and later on textiles as well. Frances Morris was the first woman professional to be hired by the museum. Here you see Miss Morris, as she was always known, in the textile study room that she created in 1910. Surrounded by visitors, we assume are textile designers, textile manufacturers, and students, as well as two objects in the exhibition that she was responsible for during her long tenure at the museum. Miss Morris was a great authority on lace, and this cravat end that you see on the far right of your screen was among the thousands of examples of lace she brought into the collection. In the center, the dynamic Native American raven rattle from the Pacific Northwest came to the Met along with other noteworthy musical instruments from around the globe, beginning in 1889, as part of a collection of another notable woman in the museum's history, Mary Elizabeth Adams Brown, who amassed and eventually donated 3,600 instruments to the museum. One of Miss Morris's many scholarly contributions to the museum was her Catalog of the Musical Instruments of Oceanica and America, which included an in-depth entry on the Raven Rattle. And now we've gotten to the Hudson-Fulton exhibition that Andrea mentioned previously, and I'll talk about it in a little more depth. Well, American fine arts were collected by the museum from its inception, and indeed many of its trustees were American artists. American decorative arts weren't considered interesting or artistic enough for inclusion. This all changed in the fall of 1909 with the Hudson-Fulton celebration. The 2-week-long event was a New York statewide commemoration of the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's exploration of the river eventually named after him, and the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's first successful steamboat. It was meant to be an educational celebration, which sought to glorify early New York history to promote assimilation following the recent arrival of millions of European immigrants. The creators of the celebration believed that knowledge of the state and nation's history would, in quotes, serve to bind a people together, make it more homogeneous, and give it stability. And it makes the inhabitants better citizens by holding up to their eyes lofty traditions to enlist their affections and inspire their imitation. This type of reasoning would later also become one of the motivations for building the Metropolitan's American wing. The museum participated in the celebration by mounting the Hudson-Fulton Loan Exhibition, half of which, as Andrea has previously mentioned, were Dutch paintings in honor of the Dutch who funded Henry Hudson's travels. The other half presented over 600 American objects and paintings from the 17th century through the early 19th. One of the innovations of the Hudson-Fulton exhibition was a display of decorative arts in chronological room-like vignettes that incorporated historic architectural elements, anticipating the 15 period rooms later installed when the American wing opened. Before the Hudson-Fulton exhibition, no one was really sure that American furniture, woodwork, silver, ceramics, glass, and textiles actually qualified as art. This conception was changed thanks to Robert DeForest, who you see here again, who became president of the Met after Morgan's death in 1913, and his wife, Emily Johnston DeForest, who happened to be the daughter of the first president of the museum, and an inveterate collector with a sophisticated eye, both of whom you see here in a medallion cast in celebration of their 50th wedding anniversary. Both loved Americana for aesthetic as well as patriotic reasons, and believed it could be used to teach history and elevate the taste of museum visitors. The popular success of the Hudson-Fulton exhibition proved to Robert DeForest that, in quotes, American domestic art was worthy of a place in an art museum. To this end, he convinced his law client, Mrs. Russell Sage, to purchase a collection of 700 pieces of Americana that became the foundation of the American wing and the impetus to create a building in which to display it. As Emily DeForest later recalled, quote, my Rob, who had gradually become very sympathetic with my hobby, said to me, you and I are becoming more and more interested in early Americana, and the more we think about it, the more we wish that such pieces of early American furniture, silver, brass, glass, and china, as are now scattered in the Metropolitan Museum, could all be collected and shown together. How would you like it if we gave to the museum an American wing in which some or all of these interesting things could be shown together? The idea apparently thrilled Emily, in her words, so the DeForest provided the funds to build the new American wing, which opened its doors in 1924 with 3 floors devoted to period rooms and decorative arts. And here you see a view, a rather romanticized view of the American wing when it first opened. Unfortunately, those glorious gardens were never built, and it always sort of stood on a rather naked piece of grass. In order to have appropriate architectural backdrops in which to display the decorative arts, the search for period interiors started almost immediately after the Hudson-Fulton show closed. In fact, Emily DeForest donated the first American architectural paneling to the museum, the rather unprepossessing fireplace wall shown here in a photo from when it entered the museum's collection in 1910. Emily salvaged it from the 18th century Hewlett House in Woodbury, Long Island, which was being demolished. When the Hewlett Room and other period rooms opened to the public in 1924, they were in a much more elegant state, as represented here by the highly decorated Philadelphia Pal Room, which was presented as an aspirational colonial interior to middle and working class visitors. Emily DeForest's taste went well beyond the traditional Anglo-American treasures collected by others in her social set. Two of her most transformative gifts to the museum were large collections of Mexican ceramics and Pennsylvania German decorative arts. When in 1904 she and Robert traveled to Mexico, she became intrigued by the antique tin-glazed earthenware ceramics of Puebla. Eventually, she collected 169 pieces, most of which she gave to the museum in 1911. In offering them, she wrote, in quotes, "The collection is important, in my opinion, not only as representing an artistic ceramic development, but more particularly as representing such a development in America. It seems to me to form a part of a collection representing the arts of Mexico, which I hope will at some time be represented in the museum as an American museum." Despite her hopes, the museum didn't concentrate on collecting Mexican arts until nearly a century after Emily's gift. The masterpiece of her group of ceramics was this 17th century basin made for washing altar linens. Not deterred by the museum's more conservative tastes, in 1933, she also donated more than 200 pieces of Pennsylvania German furniture, ceramics, metalwork, and textiles, here represented by a favorite sampler of mine made by Barbara Landis in Lancaster County. Barbara Landis was a Mennonite girl. So in closing, I'd like to talk a little bit about where the American Wing is today. In recent years, the American Wing has broadened its vision beyond the established canon of historical American art by actively pursuing works from colonial Latin America, finally following Emily DeForest's lead, as well as African American, Native American, and women artists. These two brilliant objects, seen in the exhibition, that entered the collection before 1915, now serve as signposts to the museum's continuing mission, first stated by Morgan and DeForest in 1905 to collect, in quotes, masterpieces of different countries and times to illustrate the history of art in the broadest sense. And now we'll go back to Andrea.
So I wanted to sum up and conclude by coming back to some of these treasures that were brought to the museum by Morgan, by Altman, by people at the beginning of the 20th century, but that continue to be of fascination to us today. And that is because we continue to interpret them and think about them through new eyes and with new research. So if we go back to the Toilet of Bathsheba, which I remind you is a biblical subject in which far in the tower to the left, King David, barely visible, is spying on the beautiful Bathsheba. There are two things about it that I want to bring to your attention. One is the extreme naturalism with which Rembrandt confronts the human nude. Many people have pointed out that he sits with a model in front of him, and instead of idealizing her, he paints her as he sees her. Look at her left leg, for example, with a strong marking of the garter in her skin right below her knee. He's painting what he sees in front of him. Another aspect of this, which is very interesting to us today, is the somewhat damaged figure of the serving girl who is combing her hair. We quite believe that this depicts a woman of African descent. And that brings us into a whole new field of study of people of African descent within the culture of Rembrandt's Amsterdam and what that means. So these paintings, which came to the museum so many years ago and which we believe that we know so well, actually offer us many new avenues of exploration and interpretation. And that's where we're going today. So I think we're finished with the slides now. And as I have a question for Amelia, let's take them down so that the two of us can speak. I'm so interested in what you were talking about, Amelia, building a museum and the American Wing in particular at a time when New York City was filled with recent immigrants, with new citizens, many of them from Southern Europe, and this interest in creating a wing that would introduce them to American art, American culture, American history. New York is still a city of immigrants, probably even from many more places now than they were then. What role does the American wing play in our city today?
I think the American wing plays a similar role, but with somewhat different motivations. Back in the early days when the American wing opened in 1924, that was the year that immigration essentially came to a standstill because of all sorts of restrictive rules, and immigrants were no longer in. At that moment, there was a great fear of immigrants and people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and fear of some of the movements that were going on, communism, anarchism. So the American wing, in some ways, was opened as an act of propaganda, a way to Americanize, which was the word they used, all of these people by teaching them about a somewhat fantastical American history, one that really didn't quite exist, but something that these people would think was so marvelous that they want to aspire to it and become good Americans. Today, we're not in that mode and in that mission, but what we are doing is broadening our collections to represent different types of Americans than just sort of the Euro-Americans we traditionally showed the works of and the paintings of. We have recently started displaying Native American art very strongly with a great new collection, and we have our first curator in the American wing of Native American art. We have a curator in the American wing now who does colonial Latin American art. So we've broadened our horizons a lot in that way. And I also think we're trying very hard to tell different stories. We're reinvestigating things like our American period rooms. It's a project I've been working on for the last couple of years, just looking at the other stories, not just the stories of the white owners of these houses, but perhaps the stories of the enslaved people who worked in these houses or worked for these people on plantations, because we have a number of Southern rooms. So we're trying to broaden and deepen our understanding of our objects, just like Andrew was saying in the Rembrandt painting, we're doing it with objects as well. And now I have a question for Andrea. And my question is actually in two parts. First, as a European art historian, do you still believe that art history needs to be taught in such a Eurocentric manner? And secondly, in your role as deputy director of the museum, how does the contemporary art that the museum is so strongly committed to collecting make peace with these historical collections that we have?
So, as I mentioned about the Rembrandt, I think that that the paths ahead of us are incredibly interesting and taking us into entirely new areas of study. And I am deeply committed to a way forward that Max Holein, the director, has been discussing with us and has been bringing about. And that is to really insist on cross-cultural connections, both to show areas where cultures come together, or to point out where they take different roads, but have been asking the same questions, and that this is of enormous interest to our visitors. So I see now many possibilities of embedding European art in discussions that go well past its own borders. And I'll give an example of that in the Crossroads installations that we currently have in the museum, in the medieval hall, in the intersection between Islamic, ancient Near East, and Greek and Roman on the second floor, and the one that I want to really call to your attention, which is in the Astor forecourt in the Asian department, in which works that are created by Spanish or Portuguese masters are intermingled with works made in China or the Philippines, or where Philippine artists are working for the Spanish market, ways in which that great global marketplace of the 17th and 18th century brought people together. these are the stories that interest us very much right now. We don't have to stop studying the European art, but we have to put it in a much larger context, and I think we're doing that. In terms of contemporary art, I was very struck a few years ago when we embarked on the Artists Project, in which a group of 100 contemporary artists came in and spoke about the importance of historical collections, historical works of art on their own practice. And this sense that for so many artists, there's a strong continuity. It's something that they are studying, thinking about, being inspired by. So the Metropolitan Museum is ideally placed as a ground of innovation and creativity to bring contemporary artists into our collections, to let them work with them, to help us understand them better, and to see how they have an impact on contemporary art. So I think we're in a good place in both of these things.
I'm just going to pipe in that one of my favorite things is the Kent Monkman pieces in the Great Hall that are making a very large reference to Washington crossing the Delaware, the painting we started with in this presentation.
Absolutely right, and brings it all full circle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrea and Amelia, thank you so much for sharing this history with us and for illuminating these early approaches in collecting, which had such an impact on the trajectory of the museum. It's so interesting to have this context as we consider what this legacy means for the institution today and as we shape our next chapter. Thank you again. Thank you to all of you for watching, and please come see the exhibition, which is open until January 3rd. We hope to see you soon.